I'm working with a popular education collective called Pathways to Free Education that exists in the context of the student and worker uprisings in South Africa between 2015 and 2017. So I'll just go a little bit into some of the context about that, because you can't understand what we're doing outside of that. So in about 2015, what some of you would have heard about was this furor about a statue that was at the University of Cape Town where I'm located, the Rose statue. And there was a whole lot of incidences, occupations, and so on that led to its removal. But what was actually happening was the culmination of, you could even maybe say, centuries of work and ideas about people who, now we're not just taking issue with the statue, but the basis of the conditions under which such a society comes into being. The Rose statue becomes a vehicle to make a particular point. And if you look at all the documentation in terms of what were the demands of the people making this claim, you will see broad coalitions of demands for reparations, decent living wage, increasing of financial aid for students, changes in curriculum. But one of the most important contributions during that time was to employ the method of occupation, which had not really been present in post-apartheid South African student activist spaces, where public buildings would be seized to host popular education discussions to determine how the movement would move forward. Some people compare it to the Occupy Wall Street sort of methodology. I think there are some important differences, but we can go into that a bit later. Essentially what would happen is that there was an attempt. The broader critique was that the University of Cape Town was designed to be an ivory tower, almost explicitly so. The designers even used that terminology when describing the university. It was designed to be perched on top of a hill, separate from Africa, looking down onto Africa. If you've ever been there, you'll see that that's a fairly accurate description of the spatial politics of the space. So the occupational spaces attempted to bring in organizations and people from different parts of the city to talk about what are the kinds of things that needed to happen. It was a fairly dynamic space, but of course it had the challenges and limitations of where it was and how difficult it is to move around the city. What made such a thing possible were a lot of activist work that had already been happening at the campus that were supporting workers off the back of labor brokering that had been implemented 20 years prior to that, and sort of consistent work for that. The BDS movement, there were many Pan-Africanist movements supporting political prisoners that still reside in South African jails today, among many others. So by the time the uprisings happened, many, especially international outlets, describe these incidents as being sort of spontaneous. That is totally not the case. There may have been sparks that resulted in large numbers of people joining on a spontaneous basis, but there were very clear and concerted efforts taken at pretty much every turn. So the political education was, I think, centered around these two aspects that I'm going to, as I move towards talking about the work that we're doing, which was very important, which was playing with this tension between a political meeting and an educational space. Those two things are not always the same. And I think that even throughout the day, maybe in some of the presentations, we've kind of flirted with a distinction between those two things. A political meeting, in this context, I mean a space where you are mobilizing constituencies with the attempt to bring them together to achieve some sort of objective. An educational space carries less of that sort of commitment. It's one where there's some sort of an exchange of ideas, a dialogue, and the question about whether that results in some sort of action is determined by the conditions within that space. Right? So what starts to happen is that these spaces fuel the kind of ideas and a vibrancy that attract a lot of people within the city and a lot of people who are moving. See, the great thing about universities, as we're seeing today, is that they tend to bring people who shouldn't be in this space together. And that also tends to cross international boundaries. So we also have people moving through the space from the United States. This is also happening after the Ferguson and Baltimore uprisings. And some of the currents that you find within the early decision-making moments of the movement play with some of these ideas of the political meeting, the educational space, by adopting ideas such as let's say the shift towards black power in SNCC in the mid-60s, early 70s, where there was a decision, and a very similar point in the Black Contest movement in South Africa, a decision that certain activities of a movement or breakaways of a movement altogether would organize on the basis of a front excluding white students or white liberals in particular. And that's always made, I think, just to be very clear, it's always made within a very particular context with the understanding that joint fronts can be made on the basis of some sort of common, that there's a reason why that exclusion takes place, and it's with the idea that it's possible to work under certain circumstances with the idea that it would be somehow a little bit more equal. So those kinds of shifts happen in the dynamic arena of educational spaces. So we could be talking about reflecting on the massacre of Marikana, which if you don't know, I will leave that up to you to go and find out. It's the slaying of 34 miners in a miner area in Marikana in South Africa in 2012, where people would be articulating certain positions, and it was felt that there are some conversations that are in-house. And splits would take place where we would say, no, we are taking control of the space, and we are now moving from an educational setting into a political meeting. And then in other contexts, there would be a coming together again and opening up to say, we are going to now have different layers of conversation about Marikana, where these are open conversations, these are closed house conversations. So the university and the state authorities start to realize some of the things that are emerging out of this space. Because what's important to realize, at least at this stage, is that it's still a broad front, it's still quite a non-partisan effort, is that using the courts to close down public space through the use of interdicts. So you would find that there were many, as is the case, I think, with pretty much every uprising, there are many sort of criminal or political acts of violence, or however you want to frame it. I am not aware of a single criminal case that has been taken out against a student or worker during the period of 2015 and 2017. All the cases were using civil procedure. And if you look at the justifications and the remedies that were being sought, it was essentially to prevent the gathering of meetings, and in some cases the erection of structures. So let's say barricades to prevent the entry into. So these were ways to not only curtail protest, but more importantly to close down the spaces for debate and dialogue that were happening, where we could sort of tease out some of the many issues that were affecting what was a very fractured space just prior to that moment. So when that point happens, at a time when police repression also heightens. So when the occupation spaces are taken away and people are only meeting for direct action, this coincides with many of the leadership being arrested and excluded from university, which kind of takes the wind out of the sails of a lot of the movements. Many things take place, but what comes out of that is a whole set of organizations and collectives, ours being one of them, that attempt to take the spaces that we were trying to make use of within the university, outside of the university, to use popular education techniques, to use the organizations and some of the movements that we were working alongside for many people for many years prior to the uprising, and to try and continue the work and make the broader claim that yes, a reform for free public education would be significant, but to also say that look, through these engagements and through the deep intellectual discussions that were engaged with, we realized that what we were talking about in terms of free education is not something that can be achieved within the present understanding of how the institutions work. Because we're talking about the kind of education that reflects the lives and the ideals of the people who consist of in the majority of society, right? And in the colonial context, maybe that's the same here in the US, you can tell me a bit better. The universities almost exists in denial of all of those things. It exists to classify. It exists with the almost explicit exclusion of what counts as history. So it's not simply the exclusion of bodies at a particular time, it's the exclusion of particular knowledges. So what becomes very important within our popular education spaces is this idea of dialogue, reflection, and action, right? This is that all, many of you in this room will be familiar with those kinds of methodologies. But what is important is for us to develop reference points with other parts of the world with our location in mind. So it becomes important for us to think about what was going on in Tanzania, what was going on in the United States at particular points in time, who are some of the interlocutors, and deciding that for ourselves. Because what we found that many of either the popular education resources or the debates that were happening within our space were taking number one, an ahistorical turn, and number two, we're using resources that were coming still from the 1970s, and we were still sort of talking about things as though they existed in the anti-apartheid struggle. So I think that when we're talking about the pedagogies of solidarity, which I think is a question posed, the attempt here is to try and create a space, to maintain a space outside of political party involvement, which for now is taking the shape, it has evolved into the shape of holding the space for popular education, while not conceding the ground to say that we still demand the reforms that we can gain from gaining further access to the commons through things like free education and increased access into these institutions.
Thank you.